Welcome once again this Monday morning to Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell, and my webmaster has put up the thing there on the stream, Truth Without a Muzzle. That's always been probably most of the problems I've had most of my life was that I've been speaking without a muzzle, acting without a leash. Trying to calm down that aspect of my life a little bit, but I'm still having fun. This is Monday morning, the 14th day of April. I just wanted to start off this morning by saying congratulations to Rory McIlroy. What an accomplishment. Only 5 other professional golfers have ever achieved what he did yesterday in the recorded history of golf that we have anyway. And that was the personal Grand Slam, to win all 4 of the major tournaments. He's won some of them multiple times, but not all 4 of them until yesterday. And that would be the Masters, the U.S. Open, the British Open, and the PGA Championship. Because you have to be, for 2 of those, you got to be the cream of the crop to even be entered into the tournament. And then the other 2 are open to everybody. Even the U.S. Open is open to you and me. You just have to start early qualification to get into it. So I wanted to do that, get that out of the way here before I proceed on. So many crucial things going on right now across the face of this planet, in the sense of moving closer and closer to peace, and then again still raising the specter of war. And I've had several a couple. I had a couple of discussions. We're not streaming at K-Talk. I don't think I have any control of that, to tell you the truth. I can't hear myself. I can't hear myself on the stream, so maybe I don't really have, like I said, I have no control of that. Hopefully, yeah, let me tell you, Paul, those of you on the stream, or who are streaming, just be patient. Oh, come on. There we go. All right, let's see if he can't do something about that. Thank you, Ryan, for telling me there's no streaming. I am, however, streaming at X and Facebook, or YouTube. We are streaming there, and that's why I think, maybe the only people listening right now are those who are on YouTube and X. I think you would be better off, those of you who might be listening through the tower, to go to the stream. You know, just go. You go at YouTube, just Global Affairs Unfiltered. At Facebook, it would be Global Affairs Unfiltered. At X, it would be Global Affairs UF. Just search those, and you can be a part of the stream here. So while I think Paul is doing what he can in the background to see if he can get something fixed here, I'm just going to go ahead with my program. And as I was saying, I had a couple of conversations with people regarding the tariffs. And I know that the tariffs were just a little bit about that, and then there's other things to get into. But there are a lot of people who, on both sides of the fence, and of course the tariffs in the idea of Alexander Hamilton 250 years ago or so was to protect just the brand new nascent American businesses under the Constitution from being protected from cheap British imports. And which was a great idea back then. Now, it's not it's, you know, when I think President Trump, as I've said many times, and this is something for an armchair person to say here, who has not worked in the White House, has not worked in politics, has certainly not worked in the State Department, I still think he's getting some bad advice, and I think he's proceeding from a few incorrect assumptions. And I think the advisor who possibly is urging him to do this may be the harbinger of some widespread manufacturing problems in this country. Now, I think the problem isn't going to happen. Instead, it's just disrupting a lot of the world trade, and the extent of these things is now putting a lot of the economy in turmoil. So the value of our stocks have been decreasing in the last 4 or 5 days, and the stock market just opened recently today, and they're continuing their downward slide. So I don't think it's going to work, but the effects are going to be felt not only by the countries to which it's directed, of course, but by the Americans and our consumers. And I think their policies, I think it's going to be bad for everybody, but just have to wait and see. But the extent to which I think so totally unreasonable is that there's a lot of people that are going to be hurt. So I think you're going to see the United States increasing opposition. There's already Republican representation in Congress against it. And for the average consumer, it may be a few months before they feel it, but certainly some of the workers, especially like auto workers, already being laid off because of the tariffs on parts and others that are coming in. But, you know, I think it's going to be more destructive than beneficial in the long run. But it's already affecting the financial markets, and that's where you look to see what's going on, because many of the banks are starting to unwind their derivative positions because of this. And I think that given the fact that the transatlantic financial system is so over-indebted, and you have this derivatives exposure right now to the international market position of something like $2 quadrillion in derivative contracts. So once you start to go into this, I think there's still a possibility of a great financial crash. And that's my question, because, you know, if Trump really wants to if he really wants to undo globalization like he says he does, there could be some arguments made that there is a legitimate reason for doing this, because the globalization as it's developed over the last decades has made some people it's created many more millionaires. It's certainly created many more billionaires. And many, many poor people all over the world are getting more poor because of it. So a correction of this system is desirable. You could certainly argue that, but my biggest concern is that you just can't bully people and push people around that aren't used to that kind of marketplace behavior that we have here in the United States, especially with people like President Trump, whose art of the deal isn't based on the Treaty of Westphalia. The last thing you heard was the news and a U.S. spot. I am connected to K-Talk. All right, I've got to get a text off to Paul. Let's see here. I am connected to K-Talk. And I am streaming on my channels. Is the mute button on again? Which will make it impossible to broadcast at K-Talk. All right. Paul's doing what he can in the background, for which I am forever grateful, because of the support he is to everybody else as well. So, I was talking about the financial position, yeah. $2 quadrillion in deliverable, outstanding derivative contracts. You remember what derivatives are? Derivatives are bets on bets. You can a derivative, it derives from. So suppose you have a contract. I think one of the best examples I saw some time ago was, remember the Rolling Stones album that came out a few years ago that had the big mouth and the big tongue for Mick Jagger. And there were contracts, deliverable casino, Las Vegas-oriented type contracts on how well that album would sell over a certain period of time. I mean, it's almost like the commodities market, where you're bidding on prices for certain commodities to be delivered at a certain period in time. And I remember a patient of mine who did just beans. He made his living dealing in beans, large contract. Now, beans, of course, was soybeans, and just large contracts, thousands upon thousands of bushels. And he would buy options on these contracts. And I said, well, what if your option isn't purchased before the due date? And he said, well, I'll have about 10,000 tons of beans delivered to my garage. And I said, you've never been stuck that way. No, there's always people buying contracts from contracts. Now, beans is a marketable product, but when you have, and then, all right, look, apparently I'm not broadcasting at K-Talk, so this is for you streamers out there. And Paul just said when he gets to his office, he'll try and check. He sent a message to Kristen and Dick. Thank you, Paul, very much. So when you have options for real commodities, gold, silver, beans, crude, you have to buy a certain amount of time and a certain time, be prepared to pay for it, unless somebody buys your option, which is usually what's going on out there. And the closer you get to delivery date, you know, the more the price will fluctuate. That's a real contract type of deal you can deal with. Now, here comes the Rolling Stones album. And what they did was not so much options on the delivery of the album, because that's not an option product, or at least it's not a commodity product. They would bet on the success of the album in a certain period of time. So you're deriving what you believe to be a marketable product from a real product. Now, that's what a derivative is. Now, that's kind of speculative. It's kind of crazy, but people do it. And then you have derivatives on top of derivatives, and you have tranches that have thousands of derivatives in them. And this is what happened in 2008 when this stuff came due. And we're kind of in that situation now. And when we start going into turning the markets around the world upside down through these tariffs, you risk a very real big financial crisis. And that's my question, because let's say, you know, like I said there earlier, if Trump really wants to undo globalization, and there could be a lot of arguments that there is a very legitimate reason in wanting to undo globalization. Thanks, Paul. Thanks. I don't know that I will be broadcasting on K-Talk today. And if I'm not, if I never do hook up to K-Talk, this program will probably be just about 1 hour long. Oh, I don't know. I've got plenty to talk about. Oh. Start something on K-Talk. All right, now K-Talk's playing something. Now, let me see if I can catch up to this. Well, I'm just going to talk. I don't know if I'm broadcasting at K-Talk or not. I'll just go ahead and talk. They're Paul is working feverishly in the background. Boy, where would K-Talk be without Paul? All right, so I talked about how globalization has produced more millionaires, more billionaires, and more poor people. And but the idea of bullying people, in, like he's doing with China right now, and pushing people around, it's Trump's very famous style. The 20-minute break is playing from Zara, but plus now U of U ad. But I think the proper way to have done this would have been to call a very big conference together with these nations and sat down and said, listen, boys, you know, we have been paying you out the yin-yang for all these years, and we're just not going to do it anymore. And you charge us these ridiculous tariffs. And so what he was trying to do was just strike back with tariffs. But I think it's going to backfire in the long run. But how soon Trump is forced to change, I don't know. And there's certainly a lot of uncertainties ahead as we move down the road on this. But his style is one to shake things up, and his style, Trump's style, is to show who's in charge. And he's clearly the authoritarian type leader, which. Well, there's something playing in the background at K-Talk, but not me. So he's, as I said, he's clearly an authoritarian, the bossy bully type. And he's clearly moving in a direction where, well, he did win the election. There's no issue about that. And the fact is, neither of our political parties gave a candidate, Republican or Democrat, who is dedicated to peace. And I think peace is important for us and for the entire world instead of all these continuing wars. Now, Trump said he was going to end the wars if he got elected. Well, he's kind of moving in that direction with the Ukraine, but the opposite direction with Gaza and Israel. And how much longer, you know, I think we need to remember that we are running a deficit in this country of $36 trillion. How much longer the dollar can retain its value with such a heavy load hanging over it, and given Trump's plan to cut taxes and the fact that inflation is going to continue, I see the U.S. debt may continue to rise. I mean, it's already way too high, and I think there is something that's waiting to bring not only the United States but the whole world into an economic recession and crisis of sorts. So when President Trump came in, many people, of course, were very hopeful that when he started to make signs that he wanted to normalize relations with Russia, this was the most important thing. And it was like the end of the previous administration. We had come dangerously close to a very real escalation because the U.S. long-range missiles were being launched into the territory of Russia and so forth. That Biden had held that up, and then finally, towards the end of his administration, he allowed it to happen. And we were sitting on a volcano, and I'm talking January, February of this year. We were literally sitting on a volcano. So in the beginning, it looked as if Trump was very serious about having peace with Russia. Naturally, it could not be done in the 24 hours that he said, and maybe not even weeks, but there's still a chance, and I think that that chance still exists. But in the meantime, there's a lot of other things that have complicated the overall picture. For example, Trump has promised to not only end all wars and not start new ones, but he just, 2 weeks ago, started the bombing in Yemen. And there's still a dark cloud of what's going to happen with Iran, even though the talks have opened up. And when you see what's coming out of the Europeans, at least some of the Europeans, not all of them, but the northern Europeans, they're still calling for this ridiculous coalition of the willing. And so the VW plant in Germany is now cutting back on the VWs and starting to build tanks again to send them against Russia. And this is only 80 years after the end of the Second World War. And so I don't know that we've ever had a picture as complicated as it is right now, at least not in my lifetime, fraught with all kinds of hope on one side and danger on the other. But don't you think that Trump should be encouraged to go ahead with peace with Russia? Because it's very important for Europe. It's very important for the United States, most of the Ukraine, that there is an end to this war and the settlement that will bring some kind of stability. I think the polls that we can trust coming out of the Ukraine showing at least 75% the Ukrainians want this over with. 75 is a lot. And I think the increasing amount of armaments in Western Europe is tragic because, first of all, to continue to build armament in Western Europe is completely unnecessary. Russia does not threaten the countries that are now in NATO. And the problem has been that we've been treating a very unrepresentative government in Ukraine as if it was a member of NATO, which has been a red line for Russia for decades. And yet we have been bringing in arms, we and our European allies, the most we would be required to do if they were a NATO member, but they're not. And the Russian leadership has been making it clear for over 20 years that this is an absolute red line. Bringing Western armaments into Ukraine, or I would say Belarus. I mean, frankly, we should understand that because our own countries, particularly the United States, we wouldn't tolerate armed bases in countries next to us, in Canada or Mexico or the Caribbean, armed by some foreign power. We would put up for that for 1 second. So I think the thing to say that the war in Ukraine was unprovoked is simply a misrepresentation of the facts. And now, in order to settle it, I don't think it can be settled by the establishment of borders that were created with Stalin and Hitler. And I don't think we should forget that these borders and bringing what is now Western Ukraine and uniting it with Ukraine was a creation of Stalin and Hitler, and why we want to have Ukrainians die and have their country destroyed in order to defend the heritage of Stalin and Hitler just boggles my mind, that the power of the neo-Nazi concepts are still very much alive in Kyiv. I can't understand how the United States and Europe's allies have been the victims of such a delusion that somehow the Ukraine is entitled. That I just heard Zelensky saying that yesterday. Who was he? Who was interviewing him? So, someone was, and Zelensky talked about how firm and well established their borders are, and they're not going to give it up. And I'm sitting there thinking, who are you kidding? These borders aren't even 100 years old. It was created. I've gone through this. I've gone through this before in shows in the past, decade by decade, how Ukraine ended up being what is Ukraine. And so much, what happened over time is that the cultural rights, the religious rights of these people who are mostly Russian in the eastern part of the Ukraine that was Russia at one time, and then Stalin gave it up. Lenin gave up a good portion of it. Then Stalin gave up a portion of it. Then Khrushchev reorganized it. And then Hitler, of course, changed things. And now all the violence that's going on now, that's created by these neo-Nazis, who have all the symbols, they put up monuments. They have erected monuments in Kyiv and western parts of Ukraine to these criminals from World War II, who were involved in the execution of Jewish inhabitants in what was then Eastern Poland, but is now Western Ukraine. Because remember, there's a big chunk of Poland at one time was Ukraine. No, Ukraine now at one time was a large part of Poland. Just imagine that. Is there an analogy that we could come up with here in this country? I mean, something as peaceable as West Virginia was Virginia at one time. And then after the Civil War, you get the formation of West Virginia. breaking away from Virginia because they were loyal to the North. But I don't know if there's any Virginians running around right now wanting to take back West Virginia. Anyway, it seems that the European policies are just historically myopic. And they forget the history of these borders in these countries. And they're operating today with just complete tunnel vision. Because in looking at the past, you end up forgetting a lot of relevant facts. Oh, that is something I need to tell somebody. When you concentrate so wholly on the past, you miss the current relevant facts. You're going to have to forgive me for those of you on the stream for a second. I want to write that one down. When you focus, and you could probably relate this to your personal lives, when you focus on the past, you miss the current relevant facts. Excuse me for that. I did not want to forget that. That's a very important point. So I find it hard to understand how history can be so forgotten. I don't know if there's a word in English for that. How much the Europeans have totally shrugged off the memory of their history just 80 years ago. And Russia, we got the turn on Meadow attachment one image bill. Okay, all right. Russia does not have the intent to conquer other European countries, which is now the big narrative for why all this militarization is being promoted. You know, they are even coming together in this, what was something of a secret meeting here last week, to create a new bank in Western Europe to fund the remilitarization of Western Europe. Now just think about that for a second. Because these countries are bankrupt to a large degree, especially Germany, and Merz is saying he wants 800 billion euros raised from German funds to build the armaments for the Ukraine. And von der Leyen is talking about almost, what, $1 trillion? What does she want for German remilitarization? They're going to create a bank to fund the remilitarization of Europe. And they don't have the, Russia doesn't have the capacity to conquer the rest of Europe. They don't certainly have that intention because Russia has turned away from Europe. Russia is, their business interests, their commercial, financial, political interests are turning away from Western Europe and going east to China, towards Asia, towards the BRICS. I cannot see a possible motive. I don't see but this is the narrative. And there's now been a very important development which I think bears down on that, and that's the fact that the New York Times that I talked about last week, so 2 weeks ago, printed this 13,000-word article in the New York Times after a year-long investigation that they did. And they interviewed 300 people from many countries. And the long and short of it is that they admit that from mid-April 2022 onward, the entire Ukraine war was commanded, carried out, technically assisted, and so forth from the U.S. military headquarters for Europe and Asia in Wiesbaden, Germany. That was in the New York Times 2 weeks ago. I haven't heard it on the news. I have to get it in Substack. I have to get it in some European papers. I haven't seen the United States pick that up. I haven't seen White House Caroline Leavitt, field questions about it. That the entire Ukraine war has been orchestrated, commanded, carried out, technically assisted by the United States from Wiesbaden, Germany. A 13,000, in the New York Times, no less. They brought up top Ukrainian military leaders in plain clothes back in mid-April 2022. And the article then describes in great detail that practically the entire war was conducted by the Americans from Wiesbaden, and that the Ukrainians really had a very subordinate role, basically being the cannon fodder for this operation. An American newspaper with the reputation of the New York Times, whether you know, and yes, I know it's a little left in there, but that doesn't matter. They printed this 30,000-word article over a year of research. And they brought in all kinds of testimonies. They brought in all kinds of witnesses and evidence to back up their claim that this war has been led by the United States against Russia, and that the Ukrainians were just cannon fodder. Now, I think this is a very important admission, because the whole narrative of NATO and these Northern Europeans is that this was an unprovoked war of Soviet aggression that goes back to the days of the Soviet Union, wanting to retrace its pattern to regain once again control of Western Europe and then eventually all of Europe. And if any journalist or commentator would doubt that, you are at that point in Europe in danger that you can be fined if you even question the narrative, even now. So here in America, where we are now suppressing the First Amendment of free speech, if you say anything bad about Israel, you can have some severe penalties placed upon you. You can say all the bad you want about Russia or China, but don't say anything bad about Israel. Well, while that's going on here, in Europe, journalists can be fined heavily if they question the narrative that Russia acted simply out of an act of aggression to reconquer Europe. And if you say that there was this prehistory to it going back to the NATO expansions, and you mentioned that you kind of have a reversed Cuban missile crisis because all these offensive systems are very close to the Russian border. Some of these systems have a warning time, maybe 6 minutes to Moscow. If you get close enough to the Russian border, some of these missiles that Biden finally agreed to send in there, from launch, they'll hit Moscow in 6 minutes. You can't defend that. Or you could defend it a little bit, but you certainly can't defend a whole barrage of these missiles. And so anybody who would look objectively at this situation would say, no, it wasn't unprovoked. It was very seriously provoked. So what's, the consequence of this New York Times article? I'm waiting for national news to say something about it. Because they still, have a certain amount of cover story because they say the Americans did everything right. It was just that the Ukrainians didn't obey the orders that they got from the Americans, and that's why the war was lost. Now, I don't think that fits the pattern of truth at all. My sense of justice and the sense that if you don't reintroduce truth at this debate, you can't possibly find a solution. And so I think it would be very appropriate for all the journalists, all the politicians who keep repeating the narrative of this unprovoked war of aggression should basically come out and make an apology. And, at best, at least, well, we were wrong. At least say something like that. Now, our foreign policy elite are those concentrated in Washington and many of the think tanks, and they're financed. Well, here's your trivia question of the morning. Who's the greater financial backers of the think tanks that send their lobbyists to Congress or write their op-eds in the Washington Post or produce papers? Yeah, the military-industrial complex, the weapons manufacturers. They're the ones who, They're the ones who put this false narrative together. And what has happened is that although they're telling the American people, well, we have to defend Ukraine. This is this poor little fledgling innocent democratic country that's been invaded by big bad Russia. Well, Ukraine has been invaded by Russia. That's true. But the invasion was not, has not been as complete as the American invasion of Iraq was. I mean, back in the second Bush administration when Iraq was no threat to the United States whatsoever, the United States took many of its NATO allies in that, and there is this precedent of the United States carrying out an aggressive war without provocation. And now that we know that this thing was completely run by the Americans at the expense of Ukrainian blood, what's going to happen? And so the United States, to this day, the 14th of April, continues to accuse Russia of this aggressive war, ignoring the fact that the provocation was there. And President Putin began warning in a speech back in 2007 in Munich of the things that were happening that were stressing the peace with Russia back then. And most of these were based on the expansion of NATO. And not only the expansion of NATO, but placing military bases in the Eastern European countries very close to Russia, Romania being a big example. Romania has a several hundred-kilometer border with Russia, and Romania has missiles in it. And Russia has been signaling this ever since the 1990s, that this is completely unacceptable. Now, I think we forget that when Vladimir Putin came into office, he not only straightened out Russia's economy to the degree that it had been virtually bankrupt, he brought it back into productivity. And they paid off the foreign debt of the Soviet Union and Russia in about 3 to 4 years. And he brought some regularity into the Russian economic system. So at that time, he considered himself an ally of the West, and he was trying to bring Russia into the West. He was actually courting the idea of Russia becoming part of NATO in an economic union sense. And repeatedly, there have been efforts to create a security system in this part of the world that would include Russia, as well as in the other countries, and it was simply ignored by these Western countries, France, Germany, England, as well as the United States. And instead, there seemed to be an effort to pull away all the former parts of the Soviet Union, parts that were legally in the Soviet Union, like Georgia, and particularly the Ukraine, from Russian influence. And for that reason, it was unacceptable. But the idea that somehow Russia is always aggressive forgets the fact that that was actually the Russian leader who broke up the Soviet Union. And that was Boris Yeltsin and his meetings with the leaders of Belarus and the Ukraine that brought down the Soviet Union. And that was not a victory for the West. That's not when the Cold War ended. The Cold War had ended earlier. And the United States at that time, during the first Bush administration, did not want the rest of the Soviet Union to fall apart. I mean, we had always wanted the 3 Baltic states to regain their independence. We never recognized that they were ever legally a part of the Soviet Union. And the other 12 republics that we did recognize were legally there. And as the first Bush told the Ukrainian parliament in 1991, he asked them to avoid suicidal nationalism. And yet the suicidal nationalism, the sort that had affected Georgia and brought war there to Georgia, began to be dominant in the Ukraine. And this was simply ignored by those now who argue that we have to defeat Putin or he'll be a threat to the rest of Europe. Now, Putin has done some things internally that is not the best. I certainly don't like the invasion. But in the warnings that were given from the late 1990s to not expand NATO, and particularly do not put bases there in Eastern Europe without security guarantees to Russia, would be catastrophic. And you remember, I do, that Gorbachev had negotiated the end of the Cold War. He made it clear when the question was being debated in the United States, and it's a tragedy that our prediction now has been brought to pass in the sense of you can't trust what the Western nations have to say in their continued diatribe about not 1 inch closer. But I want to make another point, that the Western European people are destroying Ukraine in this process in an attempt to simply weaken Russia. As Austin, former Defense Minister, Secretary Austin was saying, our goal is to weaken Russia. And what we've done is destroyed Ukraine. And we need Russia to cooperate in this, in what are the great challenges, the ravages of environmental degradation, the fires, the floods, and that these wars are just preventing the possibility of salvation for the Ukrainians. And there's massive migrations that are taking place. Instead of uniting to deal with these problems, we are fueling the fights not only in Ukraine, but even worse in the Middle East. And we're tolerating, I think I'd rather use the word encouraging. We're encouraging the genocidal policy that Israel is following regarding Gaza and increasingly the West Bank. And the coverage of this is just terribly biased. So when you look at the speeches that were given by Putin repeatedly when Clinton visited Moscow in 2000, when Putin spoke to the German Bundestag in 2001, he even spoke in German. He quoted all the German poets, and he expressed a very warm attitude towards Germany, which I think was very remarkable, given the fact that Germany had, after all, a leading role in the Second World War, killing 27 million Russians, which still very, very active in the minds of people who talk about the Great Patriotic War. In Russia, that's what they call World War II. They don't call it World War II. It's the Great Patriotic War. So I thought the Russian behavior in the time of German unification between the East and West, and even afterwards, was extremely generous on the part of the Russians. They agreed to let Germany be part of NATO, of all things, if there would be no expansion of NATO to the east. And what I'm really struggling with is how can these contemporary Germans, how can they be so negligent and so ignorant and so indifferent to German history? They should be grateful to Russia that there was this peaceful revolution, which was historically, I mean, you can still have peace. We've just moved into a completely different era of human civilization now. And I'm still struggling with the idea, why do the Germans hate the Russians so much? When it was the Russians who liberated the Germans from the Nazi regime. And now the potential is there to destroy all of civilization, as it's being pushed by the Germans, the German government, the newly formed, in formation government. Why don't they just admit the error? Now, back when Gorbachev and who was the chairman, and the foreign minister Shevardnadze, that if they agreed to the unification of then the two German states, and unification on terms that had been set by West Germany, which was simply to absorb the German Democratic Republic into the West German Constitution. In other words, the East German people would become part of Germany again. And the Soviet position earlier was that there had to be negotiations between the states. But events within East Germany made that impossible when the elections in February of 1990 brought in the CDU, which got the plurality of votes in the German Democratic Republic. And in any event, there was this agreement that when Germany was united, although there was nothing about NATO expansion in the agreements, that there was a provision that there would be no foreign troops, no nuclear weapons in what had then been the territory of the German Democratic Republic, which was East Germany. Now, the assurances given by the American Secretary of State and the German Foreign Minister and the British Prime Minister at the time, John Major, was that there would be no NATO expansion to the east. And as Secretary Baker, James Baker, to George I, at one point said, not 1 inch. And he was talking about the territory of the German Democratic Republic, but obviously this would apply to all of Eastern Europe. And they weren't talking about Eastern Europe because at that time they were still in the Warsaw Pact. There was never any thought that it would be expanding it any further, and the talks were about East Germany. Then the treaty did prohibit any foreign bases. So by later, when you start to look at the expansion of NATO, Putin at that time did not object to the first expansion. He didn't even object to the expansion to the 3 Baltic states. And when that was being discussed, he came to New York and made a speech at Columbia University. And what his position then was on the inclusion of these 3 Baltic states into the NATO, and he said he thought it was unnecessary, but he wouldn't oppose it so long as there were no foreign bases placed in these Baltic states. So what seems to be ignored is that it's just NATO expansion. It isn't just NATO expansion, it's foreign bases being brought into these countries. Excuse me, I always thought it was unusual that Putin would agree, no, not 1 inch further, but allowing the Baltic states to come into NATO and some of these other Eastern nations, as long as no foreign bases were established in these countries. And you don't want to forget that the anti-ballistic missile bases that were later established in Poland and Romania were using missiles. What they did is they brought in these anti-ballistic missiles into Poland and Romania, aimed at Russia. And what sometimes is missed in the discussion is that by a simple change of software, these missiles can be turned into offensive instead of defensive. So there's a good, solid reason for Putin to have opposed this. So the current war in the Ukraine is an utter tragedy, most of all, of course, for the Ukrainians, but also for Russia, because it's going to create hostility for generations between these 2 countries. But the fact is, for the peace of Europe, you're going to have a settlement on the basis, other than the total restoration of the borders that Hitler, Stalin, and in the case of Crimea, that Khrushchev created. And that's the fact, and why that isn't understood more widely in Europe and particularly in Germany is hard for me to understand, even though there are little flashes of revelatory influence in some journalistic presentations and publications, that more Europeans are waking up to this. And they realize that Russia can be a much better friend than an enemy. Now, the head of Georgia just basically said that he thinks that what's going on in these pro-war with Russia Europeans is a deep state like the United States has, that's really behind everything. Or they're in an affinity with what is the deep state in the United States, and it's just geopolitics. And what's really behind all of that is really the British Empire. People think that the British Empire vanished or that it no longer exists. Well, it just exists in different forms. First of all, you have the Commonwealth. You have the Five Eyes. Britain, Australia, the United States, New Zealand, and Canada, the Five Eyes. Then you have the financial powers that exist in Wall Street and the City of London, which is just an extension of the British Empire, because they control much of the conditions of credit and trade and so forth. And I think if you look at the role of the British in this conflict, they have been instigating again and again. Keir Starmer came to Washington in the last phase of the Biden administration, egging him on to bring those long-range missiles into the territory of Russia. So I've often mentioned this special relationship in the Anglo-American arena. When you look at this sort of empire nostalgia, this casting Russia that the West is trying to do as the eternal enemy of peace and tranquility. Because there was a contest, you know, of course, in the Crimean War, and then the contest over the control of Afghanistan, which goes back to the 19th century. And I think what exists in many of the minds, the Americans have become, in fact, the enforcers of reestablishing a sort of British Empire, inspired by the same kind of attitudes. I don't think this is in the interest of the people of the United Kingdom any more than it's in the interest of Americans. But both of these governments, and don't forget that the aggressive invasion of Iraq, which was the second Bush administration, carried out basically upon false evidence, which they knew was false when you look back at it. Who were the main allies in that? Well, it was the British. The main ally of the United States was the British. And I don't think this is really in the interest of British people, like I said, but you have maybe the committee of the, you know, the thoughts of empire, particularly in places like Crimea, which, of course, in the 19th century was attacked by the British. And by the way, you know, I learned this in my Russian class, that the great writer Leo Tolstoy was a pacifist. But he was actually a Russian artillery officer in the defense of the Crimea during the Crimean War. And any of the things that today we're fighting over emotionally for the Russians are a very integral part of their history. So one of the things the Western Europeans and Americans, I think, should understand is that this conflict is largely a civil war among the Eastern Slavs who want to control what and where they're oriented. And like other civil wars, the interference of other nations, like the United States and Western allies, simply exacerbates it. This could have been settled without a total war if the Minsk Accords had been observed. But that violation was by the signatories, France and Germany, and now you hear these people, oh, you can't trust Putin, you can't trust Putin. And if you actually look at what he said and what others have said, it's France and Germany that broke the agreements. They've broken more agreements than Putin has. And everybody's broken some, but in this case, I think you've seen an attempt to trim down Russia and try to limit its influence. And of course, it is weaker than the United States, but the fact is that what we're trying to do, as our former Secretary of Defense said, to weaken Russia, as I mentioned earlier, Austin. And we actually are doing more to divide the whole world and create, I'd say, a much larger problem for ourselves and for all of humanity, rather than weaken Russia, because you see how Russia has responded to this attempt to weaken them. Now, it's the top of the hour, and I have not reappeared at K-Talk, and I don't know why. They put on a best of show. So K-Talk's playing something, but I don't know what it is. But I think I'm gonna end this at this point, because I've got more to talk about, and I will certainly pick up this point tomorrow, because I started off talking about the tariffs and where that is bringing us now. But remember, it's the end of colonialism. It's the end of the colonial influence on this planet. Back at Yalta, when Roosevelt turned to his companions there and said, your colonial days are over. Now we're going to help these countries break free of colonialism. And then, of course, with the soon-to-be death of Roosevelt, colonialism just took off stronger than ever. And then you had the formation of the IMF and the WEF and the WTF and all these other things that have held on to the colonial influence on this planet. And then with tying this back to Trump's tariffs, you're coming to a point where this whole system is being shook up, maybe to a point where it simply might well be the end of the financial system that we know. And the only alternative to it that I think is reasonable would be BRICS, and for the United States to become a part of BRICS. So I'll pick this up at this point tomorrow. I don't want to belabor this any longer. I usually make this 2 hours long to accommodate my 2-hour time slot at K-Talk, but I've been blocked out of K-Talk this morning, so for whatever reason. So I'm going to go ahead and end this. Thank you for your participation. Would ask that you share this so we can continue to get the word out there. Truth without a muzzle. I like that. So I will bid you a fond adieu. This is Jack Stockwell at Global Affairs Unfiltered, deeply appreciating your listenership.